The moment Daniel Mercer saw the video projected across the giant LED screen in the middle of the Redwood Hills City Council chamber, his chest didn't tighten the way most people might expect it hollowed out, like something essential had quietly been scooped from him without warning, leaving behind a vacuum that made every sound sharper, colder, more distant, and yet unbearably close at the same time, because there he was, frozen in high definition, standing in the dim hallway of the Belmont Hotel, leaning too close to a woman who was not his wife, his hand resting on her waist in a way that could not be mistaken for anything innocent, while a low murmur began to ripple through the audience like a slow-moving wave-gathering force, and Daniel could hear his name whispered in fragments, broken syllables carried by strangers who suddenly felt entitled to the most intimate collapse of his life. "That's him," someone said behind him. And another voice, sharper, more eager, cut through. "City treasurer, right?" As the council chairwoman slammed her gavel once, twice, the sound barely containing the swelling noise of disbelief and quiet satisfaction, because scandals had a way of feeding people in a town like this, and Daniel knew, even before the video looped again, that nothing about this moment was accidental, that this had been planned, staged, timed for maximum damage, and his eyes instinctively moved across the chamber until they landed on Victor Hale, seated 2 rows back, arms crossed, expression unreadable, except for the faintest tightening at the corners of his mouth that Daniel recognized not as surprise but as confirmation, the look of a man watching a long-set trap finally snap shut. And in that instant, Daniel understood that this wasn't about the affair, not really. It was about everything else that had been building beneath the surface for months: the zoning dispute, the redevelopment contract, the quiet refusal Daniel had made 3 weeks ago when Victor's people had approached him with a proposal that didn't sit right, numbers that didn't add up, signatures that felt forced, and Daniel had walked away, thinking that was the end of it, that saying no was enough. But now, as the screen flickered again and the room buzzed louder, he realized he had underestimated how much Victor Hale stood to lose and how far he would go to protect it. "Mr. Mercer," the chairwoman said, her voice cutting through the noise, firm but strained, "do you care to explain the content of this recording?" And Daniel stood there, aware of every eye on him, aware of the way his wife, Leela, sat 3 seats to his left, perfectly still, her posture rigid, her face composed in a way that frightened him more than anger would have, because he knew her well enough to recognize that stillness as something deeper, something that meant she had already begun to process this, to rearrange her understanding of him in real time, and there was no quick apology that could bridge that gap, no sentence that could rewind what had just been broadcast to half the town, and yet he opened his mouth anyway, because silence would only give Victor more room to control the narrative. "This video," he began, his voice steady at first, though he could feel the tremor building underneath, was obtained and released without context, and a few scattered laughs broke out, sharp and cynical, because context didn't change what people saw, and Daniel knew it, but he pressed on, "And I believe it's part of a deliberate attempt to discredit me ahead of tonight's vote." And that word vote shifted the room slightly, because suddenly this wasn't just about infidelity, it was about power, about decisions that affected land, money, futures, and people leaned forward again, drawn back into the larger story unfolding beneath the personal wreckage, while Victor finally uncrossed his arms, leaning forward just enough to rest his elbows on his knees, as if settling in to enjoy what came next, and Daniel felt a surge of something hot and reckless rise in his chest, a defiance that cut through the numbness, because if this was how Victor wanted to play it, then the fight was already here, whether Daniel was ready or not. Later, when the chamber had emptied and the echoes of that night still clung to the walls, Daniel stood alone in his office, the blinds half drawn, the city lights bleeding through in thin strips that cut across the floor and up the side of his desk, illuminating stacks of documents he had reviewed a dozen times already, contracts tied to the Riverside redevelopment project, a deal that promised economic growth but carried inconsistencies that Daniel couldn't ignore, numbers that shifted, depending on who presented them, clauses that seemed deliberately vague, and signatures from shell companies that traced back, in complicated loops, to entities connected to Victor Hale's network, and Daniel ran his fingers along the edge of one folder, feeling the texture of the paper as if grounding himself in something tangible, because everything else felt unstable. His marriage, his reputation, his position in the city, all suddenly precarious, and he thought about Lila again, about the way she had walked out of the chamber without looking at him, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, each step precise, controlled, and final in a way that made his stomach twist, because he had always believed, perhaps naively, that whatever flaws existed in their relationship, there was a foundation strong enough to withstand them. But now he wasn't so sure, and the uncertainty gnawed at him in a way that no political threat ever had. The door to his office opened without a knock, and Daniel turned sharply, tension coiling in his shoulders before he saw who it was. "You really know how to make an exit, don't you?" said Marcus Reed, his longtime friend and legal advisor, stepping inside and closing the door behind him with a soft click, his tone light but his eyes sharp, scanning Daniel's face, assessing, always assessing. "If you're here to tell me I'm finished, you're late," Daniel replied, leaning back against the desk, crossing his arms in a mirror of Victor's earlier posture, though the gesture felt less controlled, more defensive, and Marcus exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You're not finished," he said. "But you're in deeper than you think," and he moved closer, placing a thin manila envelope on the desk between them, tapping it once with his finger. "I pulled what I could on Hale's side of the redevelopment deal," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "And it's messy, Daniel, messier than you assumed, but that also means it's dangerous." And Daniel's gaze flicked to the envelope, then back to Marcus, a flicker of something like hope mixing with the dread already sitting heavy in his chest. "How dangerous?" he asked, and Marcus hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to shift the air in the room, enough to signal that whatever answer came next wouldn't be simple, dangerous enough that someone thought destroying your personal life was the safer option than letting you keep digging, Marcus said finally. And Daniel let that settle, feeling the weight of it, because it reframed everything. The video, the timing, the precision of the attack, all pointing not just to revenge, but to fear, and fear meant there was something worth hiding, something big enough to justify this level of exposure. And Daniel felt that reckless heat return, stronger now, fueled not just by anger but by purpose, because if Victor Hale was willing to go this far, then whatever lay buried in those documents was worth uncovering, no matter the cost. Across town, in a quiet suburban home where the porch light flickered intermittently, Lila Mercer stood in the kitchen, her hands resting flat against the cool surface of the counter, her reflection faintly visible in the dark window above the sink, and she stared at it as if trying to reconcile the woman she saw there with the life she had been living just hours ago, because everything had shifted so abruptly that it felt unreal, like stepping into someone else's story without warning, and she replayed the video in her mind, not the public version, but the private implications, the small moments she had ignored over the past few months, the late nights, the vague explanations, the subtle distance that had crept into their conversations, and she felt a slow, steady anger begin to build, not explosive, not loud, but controlled, deliberate, the kind that didn't burn out quickly, but instead settled into something enduring, something that demanded answers. And as she reached for her phone, her fingers hesitated for just a second, before dialing a number she hadn't called in years, a number tied to a past she had deliberately left behind, because if Daniel was no longer the man she thought he was, then she needed to understand what else had been hidden from her, not just about him, but about everything connected to the life they had built together. Back in his office, Daniel finally opened the envelope Marcus had brought, pulling out a series of documents that immediately made his pulse quicken. Financial statements, transaction records, and a list of properties tied to the redevelopment project, each one marked with annotations in Marcus's precise handwriting. And as Daniel scanned the pages, patterns began to emerge, connections that weren't obvious at first glance but became clearer with each line, and at the center of it all was a name he hadn't expected to see. Not Victor Hale, but someone else entirely. Someone whose involvement shifted the entire scope of the situation, someone tied not just to the project, but to Daniel's own past in a way that made his stomach drop and his mind race. Because this wasn't just a political battle anymore. It was personal in a way he hadn't anticipated, and as he looked up at Marcus, his voice quieter now, edged with something that felt dangerously close to realization, he said, "You need to tell me everything you know about Eleanor Vance." And Marcus's expression changed, just slightly, enough to confirm that this name carried weight, enough to signal that the story Daniel thought he understood was about to become far more complicated than he had imagined. Marcus did not answer right away, and that silence told Daniel more than a denial would have, because Marcus was not a man who hesitated, unless he was deciding which truth would do the least damage. He reached up, loosened his tie with 2 fingers, then moved toward the window and tilted one blind slat aside just enough to look at the parking lot below, where the street lamps cast long, pale bars across the asphalt, and every parked car seemed, for a brief paranoid second, like a place someone could be sitting and watching. "You remember her as the land use attorney your father hated," Marcus said at last, letting the blind fall back into place. That was the public version, The private version is that Eleanor Vance held paper for 3 of your father's shell acquisitions in the 90s. Quietly, off the books. She cleaned titles, buried disputes, and made properties look clean enough to sell to people who never asked the right questions. Daniel stared at him, one hand still resting on the edge of the desk, fingers pressed so hard into the wood that the tendons stood out beneath the skin. A faint humming came from the old fluorescent light in the corner, and the sound suddenly seemed intolerably loud. My father's been dead 11 years, Daniel said. So why is her name in a project contract now? Marcus turned, his expression tightening. Because some families never really stop doing business. They just change signatures. Daniel let out a short breath through his nose, a humorless sound. He thought of his father's funeral, the expensive dark suits, the endless compliments from men who had admired him for being ruthless as long as it made them money, the way Daniel had stood beside the casket and felt not only grief, but relief. Relief that the man who had dominated every room and every conversation and every moral compromise in their household would no longer be there to bend the future around his will. He had built his adult life around not becoming him. He had chosen public service over development, disclosure over leverage, restraint over appetite. And now, his father's shadow was back, not in memory but in paperwork, in signatures and land parcels, and carefully hidden money that had somehow survived him. Who else knows? Daniel asked. Marcus gave him a look that landed somewhere between pity and warning. Victor knows enough to weaponize it. Eleanor knows all of it. Maybe your mother knew pieces before she died. Maybe not. But if you're asking whether Lila knows, no. If you're asking whether the council knows, not yet. If you're asking whether this could become a criminal investigation, yes. Daniel looked down at the papers again, but the numbers had blurred into dark lines and blocks. He could smell stale coffee from the mug on his desk, see a faint ring where it had marked the wood weeks earlier, and the ordinariness of that detail made him feel briefly detached from his own body, as if this could not possibly be happening in the same room where he signed budget memos and argued over grant allocations. Say it clean, he said. What is this? Marcus stepped closer and flattened one page with the side of his hand. It looks like the Riverside project is being used to consolidate parcels acquired decades ago through fraudulent title transfers. Some of those parcels were shielded through trusts. One of those trusts points back to an entity your father controlled. If the redevelopment goes through, the land value spikes, the titles get laundered through public legitimacy, and the people holding the buried interests walk away rich. Very rich. Daniel swallowed. His mouth had gone dry. And me? Marcus met his eyes. You are the clean face on the paperwork, the son who went legitimate, the elected official whose signature makes the whole thing look reform-minded instead of rotten. For a moment, Daniel could not move. He felt anger, but underneath it, something more humiliating. The possibility that he had not merely failed to see the trap, but had been selected for it because of who he was, because his integrity itself had value to the people willing to counterfeit it. He straightened slowly, forcing air into his lungs. Then Victor doesn't just want me embarrassed. No, Marcus said. He wants you desperate, compromised, and isolated. A man cut off from his wife, publicly humiliated, facing exposure, is easier to push into a signature. Daniel's jaw tightened. He already had the vote tonight. He wanted more than the vote, Marcus said. He wanted ownership. Across town, Leela sat in her sister Nora's guest room, with a lamp on low beside her and the curtains half open, though she had not really noticed either thing after she arrived. Nora had given her tea, asked only 2 questions, and then wisely left the room when Lila failed to answer the second. The house smelled faintly of lavender detergent and old books. Somewhere down the hall, the dishwasher ran in soft mechanical pulses. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the same clothes from council chambers, her blazer draped over a chair, her heels abandoned crookedly by the door, and in her lap was a small cedar box she had taken from the top shelf of the hall closet before leaving her own house. She had not opened it in years. The brass latch stuck at first, then gave way with a quiet snap. Inside were letters, photographs, one old cassette tape in a cracked case, and a folded legal pad sheet in her mother's handwriting. Her fingers hovered over the paper, then withdrew. Instead, she picked up a photograph first, because photographs always lied more gently than letters. She and Daniel at a campaign fundraiser, younger, thinner, smiling, with a kind of certainty that came from believing mutual ambition could substitute for mutual honesty. She turned it over, no date, just the name of the venue. She set it aside, and finally unfolded the page. The paper was soft with age, creased 3 times. The ink slightly bled at the edges where someone's hand had rested too long. Her mother had written only a few lines. If anything ever circles back to the Mercer land, Talk to Jonah Pike before you talk to a lawyer. Lawyers protect systems. Jonah protects facts. Lila read it twice, then a third time. Jonah Pike had once been a local investigative reporter before moving into private investigative work after a libel suit nearly ruined him. He was known for being stubborn, impolite, and right often enough to make powerful people nervous. Lila leaned back slightly, rubbing her thumb along the paper's fold. She felt grief for her mother in the old familiar way, as an ache without edges. But now it had something new threaded through it. The sensation that she had been handed a door years ago and only just realized there was a key inside it. She thought about Daniel, about the affair first because betrayal was the wound nearest the surface. But beneath that sat another bruise, older and more confusing. There had always been parts of his family story that felt edited. His father had been discussed in the polished language reserved for difficult men who left wealth behind. His mother had died before Lila met him. Family friends spoke in omissions. Lila had accepted those omissions because most marriages were built, in part, on chosen blind spots. Tonight, that choice felt pathetic. She reached for her phone and searched Jonah Pike's number. Daniel drove home after midnight with Marcus's warning repeating in his mind so steadily, it started to feel like the rhythm of the windshield wipers. Though the glass was dry and the sky had long since cleared, the city looked thinner at that hour. Storefronts went dark one by one. Traffic lights changed for empty intersections. A teenager in a fast food uniform stood smoking alone beside a dumpster, face lit briefly red when he drew in. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel and the other loose against his thigh, opening and closing his fingers every few seconds without noticing. He was not going home because he expected comfort. He was going because the performance of normalcy, however broken, still exerted a pull on him. The porch light was off. Lila's car was gone. He sat in the driveway for almost a minute before killing the engine. Inside, the house held that particular silence only an occupied home can have after one person has left it abruptly. There were traces everywhere, but no presence. A glass in the sink, with lipstick on the rim. A cardigan over the banister. The faint citrus smell of the candle Lila favored in the kitchen, long extinguished. Daniel stood there and let the emptiness meet him. Then he took out his phone and dialed her. Straight to voicemail. He did not leave a message. He set the phone down on the counter, braced both palms beside it, and lowered his head. He could still see the video, not because it had been shown publicly, but because he remembered the actual hallway, the beige carpet, the ice machine humming around the corner, the way Serena Cole had laughed softly at something he barely remembered saying before she kissed him first and he had not stepped back. It had not been an affair in the grand sweeping sense people like to imagine. It had been uglier than that in its smallness. 3 meetings over 6 weeks. One woman who worked as a consultant near the Hale network, but not close enough, Daniel had thought, to matter. One man telling himself that private weakness could be quarantined from public life. One set of choices made, not from passion, but from ego and fatigue, and the thrill of being seen as something other than responsible. That made it harder to defend, not easier. There was no great love to hide behind. Just vanity, just appetite, just failure. He closed his eyes, and shame moved through him, hot and slow. Then the phone buzzed once on the counter. A text. Not from Lila, from an unknown number. You should have signed when asked. Daniel stared at it. Then another message followed immediately. Tomorrow. 9 a.m. Belmont Hotel. Private dining room. Come alone if you want to keep your wife out of the indictment. The skin at the back of his neck went cold. He looked instinctively toward the dark window over the sink, seeing only his own reflection and the faint interior light behind it. For a moment he thought about calling Marcus, then stopped. No. First he needed to know whether the threat was bluff, leverage, or evidence that they were already moving faster than he understood. He grabbed the burner folder from his briefcase, the one Marcus had insisted he take, and read through the trust documents again at the kitchen table, while the digital clock over the stove turned from 12:43 to 1:11 to 1:36. By the time his phone buzzed a second time, this time from Lila with only 3 words, "Don't come here," his eyes were bloodshot, and his resolve had hardened into something brittle. The next morning, the Belmont Hotel lobby smelled of lemon polish and roasted coffee, with piano music drifting in from hidden speakers and sunlight pouring through the front windows in rich gold sheets that made everything seem more expensive than it already was. Daniel hated the place on sight. It looked like the kind of place where corruption wore cufflinks and called itself Civic Vision. He arrived 5 minutes early, carrying nothing but his phone and car keys. The hostess at the private dining entrance glanced up, recognized him instantly, and then rearranged her expression into professional neutrality so quickly he almost admired her. "They're waiting for you," she said. "They. Not he." Daniel followed her past the main dining room into a smaller space paneled in dark walnut. where a long table had been set with water glasses no one was drinking from. Victor Hale stood at the far end in a navy suit so perfectly tailored it seemed built around his arrogance. Beside him sat Eleanor Vance, silver-haired, elegant, wearing a cream silk blouse under a charcoal jacket, one hand resting lightly on a leather folio. She looked nothing like the monstrous figure Daniel had built in his mind overnight. That made her worse. There was no visible villainy to brace against, just composure. "Daniel," Victor said warmly, as though greeting an old friend for brunch. "Thank you for coming." Daniel remained standing. "You threatened my wife." Victor tilted his head. "No, I described consequences." Eleanor opened the folio and removed a document with slow, deliberate care. Her nails were unpainted. Her movements were economical. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly. "Rage wastes time." Daniel did not sit. "You dragged my name through the dirt in public and then invited me to a hotel. If you have something to say, say it." Eleanor studied him for a beat longer than felt polite, her gaze cool and almost clinical. "Your father was less dramatic," she said. That hit him harder than he expected. He felt it in his shoulders first, a tightening like an old reflex waking up. "I am not my father." "No," Eleanor said. "That has been both your strength and our inconvenience." Victor smiled faintly, pleased by the line. Daniel's hands curled at his sides. He noticed stupid things in sudden detail. The condensation sliding down a water glass, the muted floral pattern in the carpet, the tiny nick in Victor's left thumbnail. "Get to it," he said. Eleanor pushed the document across the table, and Daniel stepped forward just enough to read the top page without touching it. An indemnity acknowledgement, a procedural certification, language designed to appear administrative. Beneath it, buried in references and attachments, was the mechanism Marcus had predicted. If Daniel certified a narrow compliance review on the redevelopment parcels, the city's objections to legacy title challenges would effectively be neutralized long enough for the financing to close. "You sign this," Eleanor said, "and everyone breathes easier." Daniel looked up. "Including me?" Victor answered before she could. "Especially you." The council moves forward. The press loses interest. The district attorney sees no reason to chase old ghosts. Your wife gets spared the spectacle of watching your family history turned into an evidence board. Daniel laughed once. A disbelieving sound. "You think I'll help you launder this because you caught me cheating?" Victor's expression flattened. "I think people protect what they still hope to keep." Daniel felt a pulse jump in his temple. He turned to Eleanor. "Did my father blackmail people too? Or was that the innovation your generation brought to land use?" One corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "Your father understood that public virtue and private leverage are often the same currency in different rooms." Daniel leaned forward, palms pressing to the table now, finally anchoring himself in action. "Then here's what he didn't understand, and what you don't either. You made a mistake using my wife." Victor's face changed first, just a flicker, but enough. "Careful," he said. Daniel straightened. He could feel fear in his chest, real fear, because he was outnumbered, underinformed, and not entirely sure his bluff could survive scrutiny. But anger had simplified something in him overnight. It had stripped away the instinct to bargain. "You wanted me isolated," he said. "You wanted shame to do your work. But shame has a shelf life. After that, it's just math. And the math says you need my name more than I need yours." Eleanor watched him with renewed attention now, reassessing. Daniel saw it happen. He also saw Victor not seeing it, which mattered. "You're overestimating your position," Victor said. "No," Daniel replied softly. "I'm finally estimating it correctly." He reached into his pocket, took out his phone, and set it face up on the table. "Not recording, just visible." "By now," he said, "copies of the trust records tied to Mercer Development, Vance Holdings, and the Riverside parcels are with counsel outside this room. If anything happens to my wife, or if my office gets raided based on a fiction you manufactured, those copies go to the press and the state attorney general." That was not entirely true. Marcus had one set. No outside counsel yet, no AG contact. But truth, Daniel was learning too late, did not always have to arrive fully formed to be useful. Victor's jaw hardened. Eleanor, however, looked almost interested. "Who did you send them to?" she asked. Daniel held her gaze. "Someone less sentimental than me." The silence that followed had weight. He could hear silverware being rolled somewhere beyond the door, the distant murmur of hotel staff beginning lunch service, the soft hiss of the climate control above them. Victor took one step forward. "You sanctimonious little fraud," he said quietly. "Do you know how many people you're putting at risk because you want to feel clean again?" Daniel's throat tightened, but he did not look away. I'm already dirty, he said. That part's done. He picked up the unsigned document, tore it cleanly in half once, then again, and dropped the pieces onto the polished wood between them. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, not in outrage, but in calculation. Victor swore under his breath. Daniel turned and walked toward the door before his body could betray the tremor beginning in his hands. He did not run. He kept his pace even. Only when he reached the lobby and the sunlight hit his face did he realize his shirt was damp between his shoulder blades. Outside, his phone vibrated. Marcus. Daniel answered immediately. Tell me you didn't sign, Marcus said. I didn't. Good, Marcus said, but his voice was tense, clipped. Because there's another problem. Lila met with Jonah Pike this morning. Daniel stopped on the sidewalk, the hotel doors sliding shut behind him with a soft hydraulic whisper. Cars moved through the intersection ahead. A bus exhaled at the curb. Somewhere nearby, a siren rose and faded. How do you know that? Daniel asked. Marcus paused. Because Pike just called me. He says Lila has something from her mother. And Daniel, he added, voice lowering. He thinks your father didn't just bury land fraud. He thinks one witness disappeared before a county hearing in 1998, and he thinks your family paid to make that happen. Daniel felt the city around him sharpen and tilt at once. Not surprise exactly. Something worse. Recognition of a line he had always hoped his family had not crossed, because once named, it could never be folded back into rumor. He looked up at the mirrored face of the Belmont Hotel and saw only a small, distorted version of himself staring back, diminished by the glass, suit dark against the glare. He had refused one corruption and stepped into another, wider one. He had protected the city for 10 minutes and lost control of the story of his bloodline forever. He thought of Lila, holding old paper in some quiet room across town, reading herself toward a truth that might make his betrayal seem small by comparison, or else finally unforgivable in context. He thought of Victor inside, already reorganizing his attack. He thought of his father, dead, and somehow still rearranging the living. Then Daniel started walking, not toward City Hall, not toward home, but toward the reckoning he could no longer postpone, feeling with each step that saving what remained of his name might require helping destroy the Mercer one completely. He took the side streets without really choosing them, moving past storefront windows that reflected a hurried version of the morning back at him. His tie loosened now, his suit jacket unbuttoned, one hand gripping his phone while the other swung stiffly at his side. Because if he stopped walking, if he paused long enough to absorb what Marcus had just said, he was afraid the old Mercer instinct would wake fully inside him. The instinct to minimize, contain, strategize, reframe, to turn moral catastrophe into an optics problem. And Daniel knew with a cold, almost academic clarity, that this was the precise mechanism by which families like his stayed intact on paper long after they had rotted through in reality. They survived by telling themselves each revelation was merely administrative, each betrayal contextual, each crime adjacent rather than central, and he could already hear the excuses assembling in his head in voices that did not feel entirely his own: his father's dry impatience, his late mother's exhausted diplomacy, the polished legal tone of boardrooms and memorial luncheons and estate meetings where adults with expensive watches quietly agreed that decency was a lovely concept right up until it inconvenienced legacy. He turned onto Maple Avenue and stopped under the awning of a closed tailor shop, taking a breath so deep it hurt. The glass in front of him showed a faint ghost of his face over a display of headless mannequins dressed in spring jackets. He looked older than he had yesterday. It wasn't dramatic. It was specific. The skin under his eyes had gone gray. His mouth looked harder, flatter, as though some softening fiction had finally been removed. He called Leela, straight to voicemail again. This time he spoke before the tone had fully settled. Marcus told me you met Pike. I'm not asking you to stop. I know I don't get to ask for that. But don't meet anybody else alone today, please. If this goes where I think it does, Victor won't only be protecting money. He ended the call and stood still for a second longer, hearing the clatter of a delivery truck at the corner, the rustle of newspaper pages from a bench nearby where an older man was folding, one section inside another, with meticulous care, the distant metallic bark of construction work beginning several blocks south. Redwood Hills had always sold itself as stable, civic, prosperous, the kind of California-adjacent American suburb where money wore a pleasant face, and disagreements were performed through hearings and plaques and ribbon cuttings, but Daniel had spent enough years inside the machinery to know that every tidy municipality had its burial grounds, its sealed agreements, its carefully redistributed guilt. The problem was no longer discovering that truth. The problem was deciding whether he could survive telling it all the way through. He called Marcus next. I need Pike's location. Marcus did not bother asking why. Nora Winslow's house, he said. He went there. I think Lila wanted neutral ground. Daniel shut his eyes briefly. You think? I think she doesn't trust her own house right now, Marcus replied. Can you blame her? Daniel had no answer, so he let the silence take the blow. Marcus filled it anyway. Listen carefully. If Pike's right about the 1,998 disappearance, this moves beyond land fraud. It becomes conspiracy, witness tampering, maybe homicide exposure, depending on what he actually has and what can be proved. That changes who starts taking calls. That changes how desperate Victor gets. Do not walk in there trying to manage your wife. Walk in there ready to hear something that changes your last name. Daniel stared at the sidewalk, at a dark stain near the curb that might once have been coffee or oil or both. That name changed me long before today, he said quietly. I just kept pretending it hadn't. Then stop pretending, Marcus said, and hung up. Nora's house sat on a gentle rise in the older part of town, a neighborhood of broad porches, overgrown hedges, and maple trees that made the street look wealthier in October than it actually was. Daniel parked half a block away because there were already 2 cars in the driveway and one at the curb that he recognized as belonging to Jonah Pike, only because the local paper had once run a profile on the man's decline, stubborn resurrection, complete with a photograph of him leaning against the same faded blue wagon, coat collar up, eyes narrowed as if suspicious of the camera itself. Daniel remained in his car for several seconds after killing the engine. Through Nora's front window he could see motion but not faces, just shifting silhouettes crossing the bright rectangle of the dining room. He thought about leaving, not out of cowardice exactly, though some of it was that, but because entering that house meant surrendering the last advantages of ignorance. He would no longer be able to say, even privately, that he had been protecting his family without fully understanding what family meant in the Mercer vocabulary. The steering wheel was warm under his palms. He pressed them there hard, then released them, opened the door, and went inside without knocking because Nora had once told him, years ago, when things between him and Lila were still easy, that anyone who rang the bell at her house had either bad news or no manners. The smell hit him first. Coffee, old wood, lemon cleaner, something buttery from the kitchen that had been baked early and mostly forgotten. Then voices, low and tense. Nora stood near the archway to the dining room with her arms crossed, and when she saw Daniel, her face changed in a way he deserved and still found difficult to endure. Not rage, not theatrics, just a level, disappointed recognition that he had become exactly the kind of man her sister had once promised herself she would never marry. She didn't invite you, Nora said. Daniel nodded. I know. Then why are you here? Because, if Pike is telling the truth, this is bigger than my marriage. Nora gave a short, bitter laugh. That must be a comfort to you. Before Daniel could answer, Jonah Pike appeared in the archway behind her, broad-shouldered, thinning hair, shirt sleeves rolled twice, reading glasses dangling from one hand. He was older than Daniel remembered from the paper, but not softened by it. He looked like a man who had spent years learning how many ways a pleasant face could lie. He should hear it, Pike said. Nora stepped aside reluctantly. Lila sat at the dining table with a legal pad, 2 file folders, and the cedar box open near her elbow. She looked composed in the way only deeply exhausted people sometimes do, as if emotion had retreated inward to conserve energy for more consequential damage. Her eyes lifted to Daniel and held there. No greeting. No visible shock. She had expected him eventually. That hurt in its own precise way. Daniel stayed by the door at first. The room was bright with late morning sun, dust motes turning in the light above the polished table, a ceiling fan stirring the air just enough to make one loose page whisper against the wood. He noticed Lila's wedding ring was still on. He hated that he noticed it. He hated more that it still mattered. Pike gestured to an empty chair. Sit down if you can do it without interrupting. Daniel sat. The chair creaked softly beneath him. Pike slid a photocopy across the table. It was a county hearing notice dated May 1998, regarding parcel contamination claims and title challenges linked to an industrial tract on the east side, land later subdivided and buried under successive redevelopment phases. One name had been circled in black pen, Teresa Vale. She was the only witness prepared to testify that signatures on the transfer documents were forged, Pike said. Former clerical employee. Worked for a title office subcontractor. She told 2 people she was scared, one of them her sister, one of them a deputy clerk, who documented the contact in notes that were never entered formally because the hearing got postponed after she vanished. Daniel looked up slowly. Vanished how? Pike leaned one hip against the table, arms folded. Car found near a bus depot in Stockton. Person side. No body. No confirmed travel. No activity after 48 hours. Local police treated it as voluntary disappearance, After her boyfriend said she'd talked about leaving town. Boyfriend later bought a boat he couldn't afford. Nora muttered something under her breath from the doorway. Lila had not moved. Daniel turned toward her. How did your mother know about this? Lila's fingers rested on the legal pad, one nail tapping once, then stopping. She volunteered for the county records office for 6 months after my father died, she said. Her voice was steady but thinner than usual, all warmth stripped away. She found irregular filing requests tied to the Mercer land cases and made a copy of one internal memo because it bothered her. She didn't know the full story, just enough to think something had been buried. She knew Pike by reputation. She wrote me that note after she got sick. Daniel absorbed that with a strange heaviness behind the eyes, a pressure that was not yet grief because grief required cleaner lines. Why didn't she go public? He asked. Lila looked at him for a moment before answering, and the look itself was almost an accusation. Because people with children don't always confuse courage with recklessness. Pike broke in before the silence could thicken. Your father had a fixer in 1998, not Hale. Hale was still making his bones in county contracting. The fixer was a retired deputy named Warren Keats, who later did security work for Mercer Development. Keats died in 2011. Drunk driver. Conveniently, Daniel rubbed a hand over his mouth. He could smell the coffee cooling in the pot on the sideboard. His pulse had become oddly calm, the way it sometimes did in public hearings, when a crisis crossed from rumor into document, and emotions had to queue behind procedure. And Eleanor Vance? He asked. Pike nodded toward the second folder. Paper architect. Maybe not operational. Maybe. Her firm handled the trust Vales and title restructuring after Vale disappeared. That doesn't prove she ordered anything. It proves she benefited professionally from the silence. Leela finally spoke again. And Victor? Pike's eyes moved to her. Victor's current role is consolidation. He's trying to finish what they started by washing the land through public redevelopment. But from what I can tell, there's something else. Someone still living has leverage connected to Teresa Vale. A surviving relative, maybe. Or a document never turned over. Daniel felt his mind catching on that last phrase, like fabric on a nail. Something else. That was how these stories always persisted. Not because systems failed to bury them, because some fragment refused burial. Some sister held onto a copy. Some clerk made a note. Some mother hid a name in a cedar box. He looked at Lila again. She had turned slightly away from him toward the files, but he could see the tension in her jaw and in the tendons of her wrist where her hand rested on the table. He wanted, absurdly, to touch that wrist, to feel whether she would pull away before he even made contact. He kept his hands to himself. I went to the Belmont, he said. Nora's head snapped toward him. Lila's eyes followed a beat later, colder now. Of course you did, Nora said. Daniel ignored her. Victor and Eleanor wanted me to sign a compliance certification that would block legacy title objections long enough to close the financing. Pike swore softly, impressed despite himself. Did you? No. Daniel held Lila's gaze as he said it. Not because refusal erased anything, but because in this room truth had to be laid down whole, without curation. They threatened to implicate you if I refused. That landed, not loudly. Lila did not gasp or stand. She simply inhaled once and looked down at the legal pad as if refocusing her eyes required choosing not to be overwhelmed. When she spoke, her voice was almost quiet enough to miss. You don't get points for not handing me to criminals after cheating on me. Daniel let the hit land where it should. I know. Pike pushed away from the table and began pacing slowly toward the front window, a habit that made him look less like a reporter than a boxer between rounds. We are at the point, he said, where everyone in this room has to decide whether this becomes a private negotiation or a public detonation. Private keeps some people safer short term. Public gives you a chance to outrun the cleanup crews. Nora uncrossed her arms. You say that like public isn't a meat grinder. Pike stopped. It is a meat grinder. That's why corrupt people count on decent ones, fearing it more than they do. Daniel leaned back slightly, feeling the edge of the chair press into his spine. What do we actually have? Pike faced him squarely. Enough to attract serious attention if packaged correctly. Not enough to guarantee convictions today. We have your father's historic trusts, Vance-linked parcel restructuring, evidence of active coercion on Riverside, and a disappeared witness whose case can be reopened if somebody with a clean face puts his name on the line and says the right people should start digging. Clean face. The phrase would have been funny yesterday. Now it felt like an accusation disguised as strategy. Daniel looked at his own hands on the table, at the faint mark left by his wedding band, though his ring remained in place. He imagined a press conference, subpoenas, archived photographs of his father resurfacing, campaign donors distancing themselves, old acquaintances calling his choices principled only after confirming he was finished. He imagined Lila standing in the fallout, no longer merely the wife of a man caught cheating, but the wife of a mercer helping expose mercers. That would not protect her. It would make her visible in a different, crueler way. Saving the city might cost her privacy. Protecting her privacy might save Victor. There it was again, the impossible exchange at the center of everything. He raised his head. What happens if we go to law enforcement first and the press second? Pike considered. Better if you can find the right office before Victor finds the wrong one. But once this leaves the room, assume every relationship you've ever mistaken for neutral has a side. Lila closed the cedar box with a soft, decisive click. The sound drew every eye to her. She rested both hands on top of it, fingers flat. Then no more half measures, she said. Not from him. Not from me. Not from anyone. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. She had not forgiven him. She had not even moved toward him. But she was still speaking to the larger question as if they remained connected inside it, and that connection, fragile and unwilling, might be the only thing left between them that had any moral value. Nora stepped closer to her sister. Lila, think carefully. Lila's gaze did not leave Daniel's. I am. That's the problem. Pike checked his watch, then slid a business card and a folded sheet of notes toward Daniel. State-level public corruption unit. 1 deputy AG there still returns my calls. If you do this, do it before Hale realizes you tore up the document and walked. He'll already be improvising. Daniel took the card. The paper felt heavier than it should have. His thumb moved over the embossed edge once. He thought of his father again, not as a titan now, but as a man at the head of a dining table, correcting Daniel's posture when he was 14, telling him that weakness began in the body before it reached the mind. Sit straight, speak clearly, never flinch first. Daniel had spent years believing he was rejecting that education. Maybe he had only been waiting to use it differently. He stood. The room seemed to shift with him. All the morning light and old floorboards and breath-held judgment settling into a new arrangement. I'll make the call, he said. Nora looked unconvinced. Pike looked ready. Leela looked tired beyond language. Then she rose too. And for one brief, disorienting second, Daniel thought she might come with him. Instead, she stepped to the side, creating space between them that was practical and devastating at once. Do it from somewhere public, she said, and send Marcus your location every 10 minutes. It was the kind of instruction a wife might give a husband she still trusted in emergencies, or the kind a damaged ally gave a compromised witness she refused to lose before his usefulness was done. Daniel could not tell which, and perhaps that uncertainty was the price he deserved most. He nodded once. All right. He moved toward the front door, aware of Pike gathering folders behind him, aware of Nora whispering to Leela as soon as his back turned, aware above all of the fact that the next decision would not restore anything. It would only choose the shape of the ruin. On the porch, the afternoon had begun to sharpen toward heat. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower droned. A dog barked twice and stopped. Daniel looked down at the deputy AG's number in his hand, then back at the door he had just closed behind him, and understood with a sudden, terrible calm that telling the truth now would not separate him from his family's sins, nearly as much as it would bind him to their consequences forever. He stood on Nora's porch long enough for the heat to find the back of his gitted neck and settle there, a physical reminder that time was moving whether he chose to move with it or not. Then he stepped down onto the walkway and crossed to his car with the folded number in one hand and his phone in the other, already composing the first message to Marcus before he reached the driver's seat, leaving Nora's now, calling from Main and Laurel parking structure. If I stop replying, assume contact. He sent it, got an immediate check mark, and slid behind the wheel, shutting the door on the summer-thick air and the low suburban sounds outside. Though the silence inside the car was no comfort either, it only amplified the movement of his own breathing, the rustle of his jacket sleeve as he reached for the ignition, the faint rattle of coins in the cup holder that Leela had once teased him for never emptying, and that ordinary domestic memory hit him hard enough that he paused with the key halfway turned, because it was exactly the kind of detail that made loss real, not the council chamber, scandal, or Victor's threats, or even the dead witness from 1998, but the fact that he could picture Lila laughing in this car, one foot tucked under her on a road trip, complaining about his playlists, handing him fries and telling him to stop taking every turn like a deposition. He started the engine anyway and drove downtown, where the parking structure on Main and Laurel rose like an ugly concrete afterthought, beside a row of renovated brick buildings with curated window boxes and polite signage, the architecture of a city forever trying to convince itself its history had been better than it was. On the third level, he parked near the edge, where the signal was strong and the view was mostly rooftops and HVAC units. Heat shimmered above the asphalt. A pair of pigeons strutted between oil stains near the ramp. Daniel killed the engine, rolled down the window an inch, and stared at the number Pike had given him until the digits blurred, then sharpened again. This was the call that split a life into before and after, not the exposure of the affair, not the hotel meeting. This. Because once he made it, there would be no quiet retreat into private shame. Everything hidden would start seeking air. He dialed. The phone rang 3 times. A woman answered, voice clipped and low, the tone of someone whose day had already contained too much and would contain more. Deputy Attorney General Laura Bennett. Daniel swallowed once. My name is Daniel Mercer. Jonah Pike told me to call you. Silence at first, then the faint sound of typing. You are city treasurer in Redwood Hills, she said. It was not a question. Yes. And why is Jonah Pike telling elected officials to call me on a Thursday afternoon? Daniel looked out through the windshield at the glare bouncing off a silver sedan parked 2 rows over. Because I believe there is an active effort to use a public redevelopment project to conceal fraudulent land transfers tied to historic trusts, and because I was threatened this morning when I refused to sign documentation that would assist that effort. Another pause. He could hear paper moving on her end now. Perhaps not paper at all, but the bureaucratic sounds that people used when deciding how seriously to take danger. Threatened by whom? She asked. Victor Hale. And Eleanor Vance was present. This time the pause lengthened. When Bennett spoke again, her voice had changed just enough to indicate that the file in her mind had moved from speculative to live. Do you have proof of the meeting? Not recorded. Daniel forced himself not to shade the answer. But I have the proposed compliance certification they wanted signed. I tore 1 copy in front of them. There may be others. And the historic transfers? Partial documentation, trust records, parcel restructuring links. Pike has more context. My attorney Marcus Reed has copies. He listened to himself speaking in measured phrases and felt almost detached from it, as if the old Mercer training in composure had not disappeared at all, but was now being repurposed under duress. Bennett asked for Marcus's full name, Pike's number, the names of the trusts if known. Daniel supplied what he could. Then she asked, why now? The question hit with embarrassing force because he knew it was not strictly legal. It was moral, and therefore harder. Why now? Why after years of not knowing enough? Or not asking enough? Why after public humiliation? Why after his refusal at the hotel? Why only once his own name had been put to the knife? He rested his forehead briefly against the heel of his hand before answering. Because I was finally shown how current it still is, he said. And because if I wait any longer, I become part of the mechanism. Bennett let that sit. Mr. Mercer, I'm going to say this plainly. If what you're describing is even half substantiated, you are not calling to give background. You are calling to trigger a process that may put your office, your finances, your family records, and your own conduct under scrutiny, including anything the people involved might use to discredit you. Do you understand that? Daniel closed his eyes for a second. He thought of the video at council chambers, of Serena's perfume in the hotel hallway, of Lila sitting rigid at Nora's dining table with the cedar box under her hands like a guarded inheritance. Yes, he said. I understand. Good. Then here's what you're going to do. She gave instructions quickly and without ornament. Do not return to City Hall alone. Do not destroy or alter anything. Send all documents through a secure upload she would text within 5 minutes. Provide a written chronology within 2 hours. And remain available for an in-person interview before evening if logistics allowed. She also told him, in a tone that suggested unpleasant experience, that once local players sensed state interest, narratives would accelerate. They will make you small if they can, she said. Adulterer, opportunist, son protecting himself. Don't spend energy contesting adjectives. Stay on facts. Daniel almost laughed at the bleak accuracy of that, but the sound died before it formed. Understood. One more thing. Bennett added, if Hale or Vance contact you again, do not meet them privately, and if anyone attempts to leverage your spouse, tell me immediately. My spouse. The term was correct and bloodless. It allowed no assumptions about whether the marriage behind it still functioned. I will, he said. When the call ended, Daniel sat motionless with the phone in his lap. A bead of sweat slipped down between his shoulder blades. Somewhere below, on the street level, a horn blared twice, and a man shouted something that bounced incomprehensibly off the concrete walls. His own heartbeat had not slowed. If anything, it felt more deliberate now, as though his body had accepted the terms of emergency and converted them into rhythm. His phone buzzed with Bennett's secure upload link. then again with Marcus. Status? Daniel typed back. State took it seriously. Uploading now. Need copies from you and Pike. Then he called Marcus, put him on speaker, and began coordinating from the car while opening files and forwarding messages. His movements increasingly mechanical, clicking, scanning, cross-referencing, taking photographs of notes, asking Pike through Marcus for the 1998 hearing memo, asking for names spelled twice, dates confirmed, trusts properly labeled. Procedure steadied him. It always had. There was comfort in sequence when morality had become chaos. But underneath the work ran a different current, one he could not mute. The awareness that every document he sent outward reduced the chances of salvaging anything private with Lila. Exposure of his family would not cleanse his betrayal. It would simply add a public inferno to an intimate one. By the time he finished the upload, nearly 40 minutes had passed. The sun had shifted enough to throw a hard white bar across the dashboard. His stomach was empty and sour. He checked his phone for a message from Lila and found none. Then another call came in from an unknown number. He let it ring twice before answering. Daniel, Eleanor Vance said. Her voice was soft, unhurried, almost conversational. I'd hoped you were smarter than this. He glanced automatically at the parking structure entrance, though he knew she could not see him through the phone. You picked a strange definition of smart this week. You've made contact above the county level, she said. Not a guess. Information. That chilled him more than the statement itself. That means one of two things. Either you're being monitored very closely, or your attorney talks too much, or you're bluffing. Eleanor ignored that. Listen to me carefully. There are versions of the past that can be excavated, and versions that collapse the ground under everyone standing on it. You are not the only name tied to those parcels. There are people still alive who did not orchestrate the original sins, but will be consumed by the correction, including people you claim to care about. Daniel gripped the phone harder. You mean my wife? I mean your wife's mother, Eleanor said. The words landed like a slap, and for a second he thought he had misheard her. What? Your mother-in-law requested copies of county records in 2007 that she was not entitled to remove. She accepted assistance from someone inside the clerk's office to make duplicates disappear from one chain of custody and reappear in another. Not major by your father's standards, perhaps, but enough to make a prosecutor curious if they need leverage. Daniel's mouth went dry. He stared at the opposite wall of the parking structure as if it might offer translation. You're lying. No, Eleanor said. I'm reminding you that corruption rarely confines itself to villains. Sometimes good people touch bad paper because they think they're protecting family. Sometimes dead women leave their daughters more than recipes and grief. The cruelty of her calm was almost elegant. Daniel felt anger rise, but beneath it came something uglier. The recognition that Eleanor might be telling the truth, at least in part. Because truth mixed with threat was always more efficient than threat alone. If you had that, you would have used it already. Not necessarily, she said. I prefer proportion, and despite what Victor believes, I'm not eager to pulverize bystanders. But once you invite the state in, proportion vanishes. People start preserving themselves. Files broaden. Questions multiply. Your wife may discover that her mother was braver than she knew, or sloppier. The law is not sentimental about the difference. Daniel pressed his thumb against his temple. The concrete around him seemed to brighten and flatten, depth draining from the space. He thought of Lila unfolding her mother's note, of the careful way she had touched the paper, and suddenly the dead were no longer noble or compromised, but both, as most people were, if examined closely enough. What do you want? He asked. I want you, Eleanor said, to slow down long enough to understand that once this enters the formal bloodstream, nobody controls where it metastasizes. Then she hung up. Daniel sat there with the dead line against his ear until the screen went dark. For several seconds he did nothing. Then he called Lila, not expecting her to answer, and startled when she did. What? She said. No greeting, no softness, just readiness. Eleanor called me, Daniel said. She said your mother accessed records through the clerk's office in 2007, and that if the state digs wide enough, they may use it to pressure the case. Silence. He could hear faint movement on her end, perhaps footsteps, perhaps the rustle of a jacket sleeve against the phone. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Pike told me that was possible. Daniel sat up straighter. He knew? He suspected. She said. There was a receipt in the box. Copying fees. A handwritten note from someone at the clerk's office. We didn't know what it meant yet. Daniel shut his eyes. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out harsher than he intended, and Leela let it hang there long enough for him to hear the mistake in it. Because you are not the person I call first when I'm deciding who to trust with my mother's memory, she said. The truth of that moved through him almost physically. He bent forward, elbows on knees, staring at the stained concrete by his shoes. Fair. Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, Lila exhaled in a way that sounded tired rather than angry. Did you already send everything? Yes. Then it's done. Not entirely, Daniel said. If there's risk to your mother's name, she's dead, Lila cut in. Her name isn't the part I'm protecting. He knew then she meant herself, Nora, whatever remained of their family story, the version of their mother that had held steady through illness and widowhood and years of quiet competence. Pike says if your mother copied records to preserve them, intent matters, Daniel said, hearing how thin that sounded. Intent matters morally, Lila replied. Procedurally, it depends whose career needs a scalp. He almost said that this was why he had called, why he wanted her warned, but the sentence dissolved before he could shape it, because he heard how selfish it would sound, as if warning her now compensated for the years of partial honesty that had led them here. Instead, he said, State wants an in-person interview tonight. I may have to go to Sacramento. Then go, she said. He hesitated. Lila. What? There were 100 things available to him and none of them sufficient. I'm sorry had become insultingly small. I didn't know, was no longer credible as a complete defense. Even if it remained true in fragments. I love you sounded manipulative in the shadow of damage. So he said the plainest thing he had left. I won't let them use you if I can stop it. Her answer came after a pause so long he thought she might have ended the call. You already did, she said quietly. Then the line went dead. Daniel lowered the phone and sat very still. The words did not wound because they were exaggerated. They wounded because they were exact. He had let them use her the moment he created a private vulnerability that could be turned public, and whatever righteousness he now claimed existed downstream of that failure. He looked at the steering wheel, at his own hands, at the wedding band still on one of them, and for one irrational second considered taking it off, not because the marriage was formally over, not yet, but because wearing it while being told such truths felt almost performative. He left it on. Cowardice, hope, habit, he could not tell which. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Bennett. Need verbal addendum now. Did opposing party make any reference to collateral exposure beyond project documents? Daniel stared at the message. The clean legal phrasing of collateral exposure sat on top of everything Eleanor had implied. All the soft bodies beneath hard systems, the daughters inheriting boxes, the bystanders contaminated by proximity, the generations learning too late that touching evidence and touching guilt were not always easy to separate. He began typing. Yes, mentioned deceased family member accessing records in 2007, possible intimidation strategy. Then he stopped, deleted intimidation strategy, and replaced it with possible factual issue requiring disclosure. He sent it because facts first, Bennett had said. Facts first, adjectives later. The moment the message left his phone, Daniel understood that the next stage had already begun. The one in which truth no longer arrived as revelation, but as paperwork, interview notes, contradictory statements, reputations drying under fluorescent light, while strangers decided what parts of a family history were probative and what parts were merely tragic. He started the car again, readying himself to leave for Marcus's office, where the next stack of documents would already be waiting. And as he backed out of the parking space, a black SUV turned slowly into the third level and stopped 2 rows away, idling just long enough for Daniel to see Victor Hale in the rear passenger seat, looking directly at him through the tinted glass, before the vehicle reversed and disappeared back down the ramp, leaving Daniel with the unmistakable understanding that the war had moved beyond persuasion and into witness. Daniel kept the car in reverse, a fraction too long, his foot hovering between brake and gas as adrenaline moved through him in a fast metallic rush that made his fingers feel both weak and overcharged. And for one stupid second, his body suggested the oldest possible answer: drive after them, force a confrontation, demand to know whether Victor intended that little performance as intimidation or invitation. But the thought died as quickly as it came, because impulse was exactly what men like Victor relied on once institutional channels began to close around them. They wanted rage, sloppy contact, a reason to recast themselves as threatened rather than exposed. Daniel shifted into drive instead, and pulled toward the exit with steady hands he did not quite trust, watching each concrete turn of the ramp in the mirrors, as if the SUV might reappear from above or below, though it did not. And when he reached the street, the city had the nerve to look ordinary again. Lunch traffic inching along, pedestrians lingering at crosswalks, a florist's delivery van double-parked near a cafe, where 2 women sat under an umbrella, drinking iced tea, as if the world were still principally made of menus and errands and weather. He drove to Marcus's office, through that insulting normalcy, past the courthouse annex, the old train depot, now converted into retail, and the construction fencing around a luxury condo project. Victor's allies had celebrated last year as proof of Redwood Hills entering a brighter future, and every polished sign and clean curb began to look to Daniel like a stage set built to distract from the scaffolding behind it, a civic diorama with money hidden in the seams. Marcus occupied the second floor of a brick building that had once housed a dental practice and still smelled faintly, in the hallway at least, of old antiseptic beneath newer paint. When Daniel pushed through the glass door marked Reed Law Group, the receptionist looked up too quickly, then tried to smooth her expression into something neutral and failed. She was maybe 26, normally cheerful, and today her face carried the peculiar stiffness of someone who had seen the morning headlines and was trying not to show that she had joined the rest of town in silently rearranging her opinion of her employer's most frequent client. "He's in the conference room," she said. Daniel nodded and kept walking. Marcus had spread documents over the long walnut table in strict piles, the way some men arranged ammunition. He was on the phone when Daniel entered, jacket off, sleeves rolled, tie gone, his glasses sliding low on his nose. He pointed to a chair without greeting, then finished the call in clipped legal shorthand and hung up. "State sent an outreach request to the county recorder's office within 15 minutes of your upload," he said. That means Bennett didn't just take the call seriously. She moved. Daniel sat, dropping his keys on the table with a sharp little clack that seemed louder than it should have. "Victor found me in the parking structure." Marcus looked up at once. "Direct contact?" "No." "Visual. He wanted me to know I'd been seen." Marcus swore softly, then rubbed a hand over his jaw. "All right, that's not just intimidation. That's a calibration move. He's checking whether you rattle." Daniel leaned back and stared at the acoustic tiles in the ceiling for half a second before lowering his gaze again. "I rattled." Marcus gave him a dry, exhausted look. "Did you crash the car into a fountain or confess to a murder you didn't commit?" "No." "Then you rattled privately. That still counts as functional." Daniel almost smiled and didn't. Marcus slid a legal pad toward him. "Bennett wants a more exact chronology. I've started one, but she'll want your language for the Belmont meeting. No embellishment, no editorializing. Quote, threats as closely as memory allows." Daniel picked up the pen and felt the slight drag of paper beneath it. He began writing. Time, place, participants, wording. Eleanor's cream blouse. Victor's phrase, "People protect what they still hope to keep." His own tearing of the document. He forced himself to be literal, not persuasive. Each line laid something down that would not be easily picked back up. Marcus moved around the room while Daniel wrote, scanning email on his laptop, printing attachments, texting someone from the state unit about transfer protocols. The office hummed with air conditioning and muted printer noise. Through the frosted glass wall, Daniel could see blurred movement in the hallway, and once the silhouette of the receptionist pausing, perhaps to listen, before moving on. Shame had strange afterlives. Public disgrace was acute, hot, theatrical. This phase was cooler, administrative. It entered through glances, procedural tone. People choosing not to ask if you were okay because the answer no longer belonged in the category of feelings. After 15 minutes, Marcus placed a fresh sheet beside him. "Pike sent over scans from the cedar box," he said. "Receipt, note from clerk's office, and something else." Daniel looked up. At the top of the page was a copy of a handwritten memo on county letterhead, badly photocopied, diagonal shadow across one corner. It appeared to be an internal notation from 2007 referencing retrieval of archived parcel correspondence by outside volunteer support, followed by initials and a line partially obscured, but still legible enough to minds of two. To matter. Duplicate items separated. Pending review. J.M. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "J.M., he said. "That's Lila's mother?" Marcus nodded. "Joan Miller before marriage." Daniel stared at the initials until they stopped looking like letters and became what they were now. Potential leverage. Potential innocence misread as tampering. Potential stain. Eleanor wasn't bluffing. "Probably not," Marcus said. "But that doesn't mean the interpretation goes their way. It depends what Joan Miller separated, why, and whether she preserved it." He tapped another page. "Pike thinks there may have been an enclosed note or attachment missing from the box. Something your mother-in-law copied or extracted. He's checking whether Nora remembers more." Daniel pushed back from the table and stood, suddenly unable to stay seated with that much paper in front of him. He crossed to the window and looked down at the alley behind the building, where a delivery driver in a red cap was smoking beside stacked crates of bottled water. The alley brick held the heat. A gull circled once overhead, though they were nowhere near the coast. "I need to see Lila," he said. Marcus didn't respond immediately. "Why?" "Because if her mother's name gets pulled in, I want her to hear the timing from me before it happens." Marcus leaned against the table, arms crossed. "That's not the only reason." Daniel let out a breath through his nose. "No. You're in the middle of a corruption referral," Marcus said. "Not a reconciliation montage." "I know. Do you?" Marcus's tone stayed even, but the question hit hard anyway. Daniel turned from the window. "No. I don't know anything cleanly right now. I know she has a right to hate me. I know Victor is trying to use her. I know I let that become possible. And I know if state investigators show up at Nora's before I say a word, it'll look like I'm still deciding what truth she can handle." Marcus considered him, then nodded once, reluctant. "Call first, don't just arrive. And keep it short." Daniel took out his phone and stared at Lila's name for several seconds. He hated that he was calculating tone, hated that sincerity itself now required strategy because he had made strategy necessary in every intimate exchange. He typed instead of calling, "State is moving faster than expected. Eleanor's claim about your mother may surface in formal questions soon. I'd rather tell you face to face if you'll allow 10 minutes in a public place." He sent it and put the phone face down on the table before he could watch the silence lengthen. Then he sat back down and resumed the chronology, because work at least had the decency to demand completion. At 3:30, Bennett called again, this time on video, and Marcus joined from the chair beside Daniel, while a second man from her office, younger, narrower, with a federal haircut and careful eyes, appeared in another square on the screen. Bennett asked for a verbal walkthrough from the start. Daniel gave it. She interrupted often, not to challenge but to pin down. "When you say threatened your wife, what were the exact words? When you say historic trusts, name them. When did your father die? Did you ever personally benefit from distributions linked to Mercer Development after your election?" That last one tightened the room. Daniel answered yes, then clarified. Distributions from family estate holdings he had previously believed clean and had disclosed in broad form, but not understood in parcel-specific relation to Riverside. Bennett did not react visibly. She only wrote something down. The younger man asked about Serena Cole, which jolted Daniel more than he expected. "We're aware there may be a potential access point through your personal conduct," he said. "Was Miss Cole placed near you?" Daniel swallowed. The office air felt colder now. "I don't know," he admitted. "I believed the encounters were private and mutual." Bennett's gaze did not soften. Private and mutual does not mean unengineered. Daniel felt a small flare of self-disgust at the relief that sentence gave him, because it offered no absolution, only a more complicated humiliation. He had still chosen every step, but the possibility that he had also been played made the memory of those hotel meetings curdle further. "Can you identify her role?" Bennett asked. "Consulting subcontractor. Regional communications, I think. Adjacent to Hale's network. Not core staff." The younger man made a note. "We'll want everything you have on dates, messages, gifts, reservations, anything." Daniel almost laughed at the bleakness of that too. The affair would now be inventory. Bennett ended the call by telling them agents might be sent to Redwood Hills by evening, and that Daniel should not attend any unscheduled public events, especially not City Hall. "Your value right now is as a witness with access," she said. "Don't become a spectacle by accident." When the screen went dark, Marcus leaned back and rubbed both eyes with thumb and forefinger. "Well," he said after a moment, "they're either building a case or rehearsing for one." Daniel's phone lit up then with Lila's reply. 10 minutes. Public Library Courtyard. 5. Don't be late. He stared at the message long enough that Marcus noticed. "She agreed?" Marcus asked. Daniel nodded. Something low and unstable moved in his chest. Not hope exactly, because hope implied an emotional opening that did not exist, but the raw fact of continued access. She would still stand in the same physical space and hear him speak. That had become enough to feel dangerous. The library courtyard sat between the old Carnegie building and a newer glass addition, a square of low brick planters, sycamore shade, and metal benches painted municipal green. By 5, the sun had angled enough to leave half the space in patchy relief, and a fountain near the center made a soft repeating splash that covered just enough sound to make private conversations possible without seeming secret. Daniel arrived early and took a position near the fountain with his hands in his pockets, watching children drift out with summer reading bags. An elderly man return a stack of westerns through the slot, 2 teenage girls sharing headphones and laughing over something on a phone screen. No one looked at him twice, though he half expected recognition now everywhere he went. Maybe scandals still required context at close range. Maybe from 10 feet away, he was just another tired man in a suit waiting to be told whether he would remain part of his own life. Lila came through the side gate at exactly 5, wearing jeans and a pale blue blouse with the sleeves rolled once, hair pulled back loosely, as if she had redone it in a hurry and not cared whether a few strands escaped. She stopped 2 paces away, not offering a hug or a hand or any substitute gesture, and Daniel noticed immediately that her wedding ring was gone. The absence struck with a clarity that bypassed language. He had known this might happen. He had perhaps expected it. Still, seeing the bare place on her finger made the afternoon seem to narrow. Lila followed his glance and did not hide her hand. "You said 10 minutes, she said. "Right." Daniel nodded once, gathering himself. "State investigators may ask about your mother's record access very soon." Eleanor confirmed they know about it, which means Victor does too. Bennett has already been told there may be a factual issue there. I wanted you to hear that from me, not from a knock on Nora's door. Leela listened without interruption, one arm folded lightly across her waist, the other hanging at her side. Behind her, the fountain water flashed in the sun. "Do they think she committed a crime?" she asked. "I don't know yet." He forced himself not to soften the uncertainty. "It depends how they interpret intent, chain of custody, and what exactly she took or copied. That's a lawyer sentence. Yes, I asked a human one. Daniel, let the rebuke settle." "Human answer," he said quietly. "I think your mother believed she was preserving something important. I think powerful people may describe that differently if it helps them." Lila looked past him for a moment toward the library steps where a woman was helping a boy zip up a backpack. When she looked back, her face had not hardened so much as tired further. "Nora found something after you left," she said. A second note tucked into the lining of the box lid. "My mother's handwriting. She wrote that if Joan Miller was ever mentioned by men in suits, we should assume those men were afraid of whatever she kept." Daniel felt his pulse jump. "Did the note say where?" "No." "Does Pike think there's another document?" "He thinks there almost has to be." Lila's mouth tightened slightly. "That's the problem with dead people and clues. Everyone starts sounding thrilled." Daniel almost said that Pike wasn't thrilled, only energized. But he heard how inadequate that distinction would sound. "I'm sorry," he said instead. Lila's expression did not change. "For which part?" There it was, the question too large to answer honestly in one pass and too necessary to dodge. Daniel looked at her bare ring finger again, then forced himself back to her face. "For making you vulnerable before any of this surfaced. For giving them a way to reach you. For every conversation in the last few months where I edited myself because honesty would have cost me comfort. And for not knowing enough about my own family to keep you out of their damage." Lila stood very still. The sounds around them seemed suddenly more distinct, the fountain's drip, a skateboard rattling past on the sidewalk beyond the wall, leaves shifting overhead in a dry breeze. "You want to know the worst part?" she asked. "The affair isn't even what keeps replaying now. It's all the smaller things that make it possible. How calmly you lied when you were late. How practiced your face was when you said work ran long. How I helped defend you to my sister because I thought trust meant refusing paranoia." She looked down once, then back up, and when she continued, her voice was steady enough to cut. "I don't know where your family's corruption ends and your personal one begins. Right now, they feel like the same muscle." Daniel took that without speaking. Anything defensive would have been obscene. A child laughed somewhere behind him. A book cart squeaked across the library tile inside the open doors. The world, indecently, remained structured around small continuities. Lila checked her watch. "You have 3 minutes." Daniel nodded, because he had promised 10, and because bargaining with time felt as useless as bargaining with consequence. "If Pike finds the missing document, and if it helps protect your mother's role, I'll make sure Bennett gets it immediately." Lila tilted her head slightly. "You'll make sure?" "I'll help. That's different." "Yes," Daniel said. "It is." He took a breath. "I don't expect anything from you. Not forgiveness, not patience. But I needed to say this while there's still a version of events where I tell the truth before being cornered into it." Lila's eyes moved over his face as if checking for signs of performance. Maybe there were some. Maybe after enough lying, sincerity always looked partially rehearsed. "Then hear this before you run back into your procedural heroism," she said. "If exposing your father saves the city and destroys what's left of us, I will still tell the truth. I'm not choosing our marriage over facts. You lost that privilege." Daniel felt the words land. And behind the pain there was also, strangely, relief. Because the terms were finally clean. No sentimental loopholes. No domestic exemption from reality. "Understood," he said. Lila nodded once. "Good." She stepped back, creating distance again, and for one suspended second, It seemed possible she might leave on that note and take the rest of the daylight with her. Instead, she reached into her bag, withdrew a folded slip of yellow paper, and held it out. "Pike made a photocopy for you," she said. "My mother's second note." Daniel took it carefully. The paper was warm from her bag. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." Her eyes held his for one last beat, unreadable now in a way that felt more final than anger. "If what's missing is what I think it is, this stops being about preserving names. It becomes about who is willing to burn them first." Then she turned and walked back toward the gate, leaving Daniel by the fountain with the paper in his hand, the beginning of evening cooling the air around him, and the unmistakable sense that the next document he unfolded might drag the story out of accusation and into proof. Daniel did not unfold the note immediately. He stood there beside the fountain with the yellow paper pinched between his fingers, watching Lila disappear through the library gate and into the spill of evening pedestrians on Laurel Street, and there was something almost unbearably precise about the way she did not look back. Not out of theatrical cruelty, but because looking back would have implied a softness she no longer trusted in herself. And Daniel understood that with the dull, exact comprehension that often hurt more than surprise. A breeze moved through the sycamore leaves overhead, stirring a dry whisper that made the courtyard feel briefly cooler. Somewhere behind him, the library doors opened and closed, each hydraulic hush, marking a life continuing in small, ordinary cycles, while his own had narrowed to evidence, chronology, names, and whatever dead woman's handwriting now waited in his hand. He crossed to the far bench near the brick planter, sat down, and unfolded the paper carefully. The photocopy was faint but readable. Joan Miller's handwriting leaned slightly right, compact and neat, except where haste had tightened certain letters into sharp angles. If Teresa's sister ever comes forward, she must be told the county copy is not the only one. Warren brought the original note to Mercer after the hearing was delayed. "I never saw the original again, but I copied enough before it vanished." The note was not about signatures. It was about where Teresa said the money came from and who told Keats to solve it before county gets religion. "If this reaches Lila, do not trust anyone who says the land is the whole story." Daniel read it twice, then a third time, his thumb pressing harder into the edge of the page each time without his realizing it. Not about signatures, about where the money came from. The line struck like a hidden seam, suddenly giving way beneath the surface of everything they had already uncovered. For a moment he felt only the simple, mechanical reaction of a mind rearranging itself under new weight. Father, Keats, Teresa Valle, not just forged transfers but motive tied to funding, and someone above Keats giving instructions with language casual enough to suggest habit. Then a second thought followed, colder. If Joan Miller had copied enough before it vanished, then somewhere there might be a fragment, a transcription, notes, something with names, something prosecutable. Daniel took out his phone and photographed the photocopy in better light, then called Pike. He answered on the second ring. "I was about to call you," Pike said. "Nora found a false bottom in the cedar box." Daniel stood so fast the bench scraped against the brick. "What's in it?" "One cassette tape and 3 folded pages. I haven't played the tape yet. Waiting for you and Marcus." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The fountain behind him kept repeating its soft splash, absurdly serene. "I'm coming now." Pike gave him Nora's address only to confirm what Daniel already knew, then added, "Drive like a man who understands endings, don't care how righteous you feel." Daniel almost said something sharp back, but Pike was right often enough to make anger inefficient. He hung up and texted Marcus. Box had false bottom, tape plus pages, going to Nora's now. Then he headed to his car with the note still in his hand. The drive across town took 18 minutes and felt like being slowly tightened from the inside. At every red light, he looked again at Joan Miller's words in his mind, testing them for overreach, wondering whether dead people ever understood how much power they retained when they chose precision over drama. "Solve it before county gets religion." That was the line. It sounded like men standing in a doorway after a meeting, half amused, deciding the moral weather might be shifting and acting before it did. Not the language of panic, the language of practice. Daniel parked crookedly at Nora's curb, and corrected only once, because the old training in appearances still clung even under pressure. Inside, the house no longer felt like neutral ground. It felt like a command center assembled under domestic lighting. The dining table had been cleared except for the new materials. A tape recorder Pike must have borrowed from somewhere. Marcus's laptop bag, 2 mugs gone cold, and the cedar box with its base removed and set aside. Nora stood near the kitchen doorway, arms wrapped around herself. Leela sat at the table again, but her stillness had changed. It was no longer only defensive. There was focus in it now, the exhausted concentration of someone who has crossed a threshold and accepted that private grief will not be allowed to remain private. She did not greet Daniel when he came in, but she did not ask him to leave either. Marcus arrived less than a minute later, slightly out of breath, tie still absent, legal pad already in hand. Pike tapped the 3 folded pages. "These were under the false panel," he said. "2 are Jones' notes. 1 is a partial transcription of an interview or statement. I haven't read them aloud yet." Daniel took the chair nearest the tape recorder. The room smelled of coffee reheated too many times, and the faint onion butter trace of something Nora must have cooked earlier, but no one had eaten. Outside, a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically in a neighboring yard. Pike unfolded the first page and began reading. Joan Miller had written dates, initials, and observations with the compressed discipline of someone terrified of being overheard even in memory. She described volunteering in records, finding misfiled parcel correspondence, locating a copy request tied to Teresa Vale's postponed hearing, and later being approached, though not directly threatened, by a man matching Warren Keats's description, who asked too gently whether she had seen anything that could confuse county storage. The second page was worse. Joan recorded a conversation she had with an unnamed clerk who told her, after too much wine at a holiday gathering, that Teresa Vale's original handwritten note had described money routed through a civic improvement fund, linked to R.H. advancement, then crossed out the full phrase and written only the initials RHAF. Daniel felt the letters land immediately. Redwood Hills Advancement Foundation, a legacy nonprofit long praised for sponsoring parks, scholarships, historical restoration, and campaign-adjacent goodwill projects, too tasteful to be called patronage in public. His father had chaired it for years. Victor Hale had joined the board after his death. Marcus swore under his breath. Pike kept reading. Joan believed the fund had been used to move money into land cleanup and title actions, in ways that blurred public benefit spending with private acquisition. Then came the third page, the partial transcription. Pike read more slowly now, because every line mattered. Teresa's voice had not survived, only her words copied by someone else before the original disappeared. She said she was willing to testify that transfer signatures were forged after closings had been backdated. She also said the money pressure on the tract came from the foundation men, not just developers, and that Warren Keats told her she was making church ladies and council people nervous over land they already promised to God and donors. The room went very quiet after that sentence. Even the sprinkler outside had stopped. Marcus broke the silence first. RHAF had church partnerships, school board partnerships, county beautification grants, he said. If public-facing charitable dollars or influence were used as cover for pressure on titles, this goes broader than Mercer and Hale. It touches electeds, clergy, civic donors. Nora, who had been silent too long, said, in English. Marcus looked at her. In English, your mother may have found proof that respectable people built the town with money they pretended was charitable while using it to choke out land claims. Daniel sat with his elbows on the table and both hands over his mouth, staring at Joan Miller's notes. The image that came to him was not of his father in a boardroom, but of him in church on Christmas Eve, hand on Daniel's shoulder, nodding solemnly through hymns, afterward shaking hands in the vestibule like a man consecrating the whole town through his presence. The hypocrisy was almost too familiar to sting at first. Then it did sting, because beneath the public sanctimony, there had apparently been a financing network dense enough to pull in institutions people mistook for moral ballast. Lila reached for the cassette tape. Play it, she said. Pike looked at the machine. No guarantee there's anything usable. Play it. Her tone was flat, not dramatic, and somehow that made everyone move faster. Pike inserted the tape, pressed rewind, and the tiny machine answered with a dry mechanical whir that seemed absurdly fragile for carrying anything this consequential. When he hit play, static filled the room first, followed by a few muffled bumps, and then a woman's voice, thin with age and tape warble, but unmistakably Joan Miller. If I'm recording this, it means I don't trust paper alone, she said. Lila shut her eyes. Daniel looked at her, then back at the recorder. Joan continued, haltingly at first, then with more momentum, as if speech had finally outrun caution. She said she had copied parts of Teresa Vale's missing note after being shown it by a scared man at county who believed it would be taken if logged. She said Teresa named Warren Keats as the one who came to her apartment, but Keats didn't speak like the top. She said the name she heard, twice, once from the county clerk and once from another source too frightened to repeat publicly, was not Victor Hale, and not Eleanor Vance, and not even Mercer first, though Mercer benefited. The name was Reverend Thomas Bell. Nora made a soft sound of disbelief. Marcus straightened sharply. Pike lunged for his pad and wrote the name down anyway, as if tape could evaporate if not pinned to paper. Reverend Bell had been one of Redwood Hills' most revered figures, founder of the charitable housing initiative attached to RHAF. Dead for 6 years, memorialized in a park and a scholarship. Joan's voice on the tape shook slightly as she explained that Bell was believed to have brokered the moral cover for the land deals, persuading families and local leaders that the industrial tract had to be redeemed for community use, while donor funds and civic partnerships created pressure around titles. The money had church face on it, she said on the tape. That's why people trusted it. Then her voice lowered. Thomas Bell and Charles Mercer were in it together. Bell blessed it. Mercer fed it. Keats handled fear. Daniel felt his whole body go very still. It was one thing to learn his father had helped launder land through shell structures. It was another to hear him named in partnership with a dead reverend whose legacy had been packaged as benevolence. The corruption was no longer merely greed. It was liturgy, philanthropy, civic identity, all the soft, respectable cloth under which harder mechanisms had been hidden. Joan's recording continued. She said she had never found Teresa Vale, had never proved what happened after the disappearance, but believed the note mattered because it connected the charity network to the land network and explained why so many good people defended bad outcomes. They thought they were helping a future. Maybe some still do, she said. But if Lila hears this, or Nora, do not let them tell you your mother kept quiet because she was weak. I kept quiet because I had daughters, and not enough proof to bury men who owned the town. If proof turns up later, use it whole. Half-truth protects them. The tape clicked, hissed, and ended. No one moved. The silence that followed was not stunned exactly. It was full, occupied by the sound of everyone recalculating the moral map at once. Daniel became aware of tiny things with painful clarity. The way the recorder's red light stayed on after the tape had stopped. The faint rattle in Pike's breathing. Nora's thumbnail pressing crescent marks into the side of her hand. Marcus's pen uncapped but motionless. Lila staring at the machine as if willing her mother's voice to come back and say one more practical thing. One more navigational thing, something daughters could use instead of only burden. Daniel looked down at his hands and saw that they were trembling now, not from fear of Victor or the state, but from the intimate horror of hearing his father named plainly by a dead woman who had spent years carrying the edges of a truth he had been privileged not to seek. Lila spoke first. "We give all of it to Bennett," she said. No one argued. Marcus nodded almost immediately. "Yes," Pike said. "Before night if possible. Once Bell's name is in play, local containment gets impossible. Too many reputations tied to his." Nora took a shaky breath. "And my mother?" Marcus answered, with the care of a man who knew language could still do damage. "Your mother becomes a preservation witness in absentia if the state sees it that way. Not someone tampering to profit, but someone safeguarding evidence she was afraid would vanish." Nora laughed once, bitter and wet-eyed. "So she still has to be dead, before anyone believes she was right." Lila reached for her sister's hand under the table. Daniel watched them, the gesture small and instinctive, and knew with a painful clarity that this bond, this history, this private inheritance was the family unit with real moral substance in the room, not the Mercer name, not his marriage as legal structure, not any institution he had spent his adult life serving. He was connected to it, only by damaged extension now. Pike began scanning the pages with his phone, while Marcus set up a secure transfer from his laptop to Bennett's office. Daniel remained seated because standing felt performative, and speaking felt dangerous, yet eventually silence itself became a kind of cowardice, and he heard himself say, "My father should be named first." 4 faces turned toward him. He went on before the sentence could be mistaken for self-punishment alone. "Not because Bell doesn't matter. He does. But Mercer funded, structured, and benefited. I won't let this become a story where the Reverend's halo absorbs my father's machinery." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "That's strategically right too," he said. "Lead with the land actor who had direct control and surviving corporate traces. Bell expands the web. Mercer anchors it." Lila did not praise the point. She only said, "Then say it that way when Bennett asks." Daniel met her eyes. "I will." She held his gaze for one beat longer, and though there was no forgiveness in it, there was recognition of a narrower, harsher thing, that he had finally stopped trying to exit the story through personal sorrow, and was instead stepping more completely into culpable inheritance. It was not redemption. It was simply accuracy. Marcus sent the files. Pike made backup copies. Nora wiped at her eyes, and then, with practical fury, started making fresh coffee because there was nothing else to do with her hands. Outside, night gathered slowly against the windows, turning the reflected room back on itself so that everyone's faces floated faintly over the dark yard. At 8:17, Bennett called. Marcus put her on speaker. Daniel gave the addendum himself this time. Joan Miller's notes, Teresa Vale's statement fragment, the RHAF reference, Reverend Thomas Bell, Charles Mercer, Warren Keats, the phrase, "solve it," before county gets religion. Bennett did not interrupt often. When she did, it was only to clarify dates and chain of possession. At the end, she said, "Agents are being dispatched tonight. We will seek emergency preservation orders at opening tomorrow. Mr. Mercer, given the expansion of potential public corruption scope, I need to ask directly whether you are prepared to make a formal recorded statement under oath within the next 12 hours. Daniel looked around the table. At Lila. At the cedar box. At the space where his father's name now sat on paper and tape like a final debt coming due. He thought briefly of what this would mean by morning. Headlines, foundation board resignations, church statements, old donors pretending not to remember, Victor Hale pivoting, denying, sacrificing others if he could. He also thought of Teresa Vale, a woman he had never met, disappearing into decades of civic amnesia, while men consecrated parks in each other's honor. "Yes," he said. "I'm prepared." Bennett's voice remained even. "Then be ready at 6. Location to follow. Do not discuss this outside counsel and named parties in the room." The call ended. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Nora set the coffee mugs down harder than necessary and said, "My mother kept that in my hallway closet for 15 years. Lila rose from the table, one hand on the cedar box lid, the other braced briefly against the wood, as if the day had at last become heavy enough to tilt her balance. Daniel stood too, but not toward her, not trying to occupy intimacy he had forfeited. The room felt smaller now, the paths through it more defined. Marcus gathered papers for the morning. Pike copied numbers into a notebook with reverent impatience. Nora stared at the box as if it might still contain one more trapdoor. Lila lifted her eyes to Daniel. "Tomorrow," she said. "You tell it all the way." He nodded. "Yes." She looked at him a moment longer, then added, with no softness and no cruelty, only exhausted truth. "And when you're done, whatever survives won't be what you were trying to save." Daniel accepted that because there was nothing else left worthy of acceptance. Later, when he stepped out onto Nora's porch to leave, the night air smelled of wet soil and cut grass, and the street was almost silent, except for the distant passage of one car and the thin electric buzz of a porch light somewhere down the block. He stood there with his hand on the railing and understood that by dawn, the Mercer name would begin its public collapse in earnest, not erased, not purified, but stripped of the respectable disguises that had protected it for too long, and that the price of helping cause that collapse would not be the restoration of his marriage or the cleansing of his conscience, only the harder, lonelier privilege of no longer lying about what built his life.